welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am your host, Jessica. I am here with the author of a book called The Great MANN, which absolutely just blew me away. And before we really get into it, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about this book?
Yeah, well, my name is Kyra Davis Lurie, and The Great MANN is a 1945 Black reimagining of The Great Gatsby set in the historic affluent American, Black African American Los Angeles neighborhood of Sugar Hill. And it was a time when there were all these mansions there, and the wealthy white aristocracy of Los Angeles were living there. But when the Depression hit, they had to sell those mansions because they're hard to keep up. And the only people available to buy were the really wealthy African Americans. So you had oil tycoons, business moguls, hoteliers, and of course the Black movie stars. And Hattie McDaniel was throwing these gala parties with Bing Crosby and Clark Gable and Lena Horne and Duke Ellington as the entertainment. And I thought, well, okay, that's Gatsby-esque. So I brought the structure of The Great Gatsby into this real world in order to use a familiar story to elevate a little known Black history.
And now Sugar Hill is completely gone. It was basically leveled to build an expressway.
Yeah, and that's the thing that's like, it's haunting and, to be honest, a little distressing in that you go there and there's still some mansions left. A lot of them were taken by eminent domain in the mid-50s and where they built the freeway in the 60s. And it was, these were gorgeous homes that they took, right? But there's still some left. And obviously, when you put a freeway right through in the middle of a neighborhood, it dramatically changes the neighborhood, decreases the property value, but the homes are still there, and some of them. And it's like, and you see vestiges of that grandeur, and it's frustrating because it's like, wait, they were constantly devaluing Black property, saying, okay, that's what they called urban renewal. It's like any time that there was a Black property, it's like, oh, well, that's a slum, right? And these were mansions. These people were not living in slums, right? So it's frustrating to see that brought down. But on the other hand, it's empowering to see what was built at a time when pretty much every law was designed to keep African Americans from building wealth. So to see what these people did, the way they defied the odds and self-actualized like that is amazing. And that's why I set the book not in the destruction, but in the creation. I don't think we see the creation that often. Destroying Black neighborhoods it's almost cliche. It's not, but the creation is pretty incredible.
Yeah, and I think there's just a ton of nuance in the story. So, you have like the players, one might say, you have Charlie, who would be kind of coming at it from Nick's point of view. You have Margie or Marguerite.
Yes.
Who is Daisy. And then, you have James Mann, who's also called Reaper, which was very interesting. And I'm not going to say anything else about it because you really have to read the book to kind of dig into that. And then you have also Anna, who I loved, by the way. She was very interesting. And, you have who I suppose would kind of be like the Jordan equivalent, but I think I don't know, I liked her better.
Well, yeah, because the interesting thing about Gatsby is that his protagonist, Nick, is not the main character of that book. The main character is Jay Gatsby. And so
100%. Yeah, I mean, like, let's be honest, like Nick is kind of like
he's just
the
there to be
toast that
here.
kind of just, like he's very dry. He's there to kind of just like soak up and introduce people who are far more interesting than him.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, like, as a result, the only relationship in Nick's life that we really care about is his relationship to Gatsby. Okay. The rest of it, Jordan she's an ancillary character. She's just not that important, But and I have to say, I do respect the way that Fitzgerald was able to maneuver that so that, you could have a protagonist and still have that's not that dynamic, but then use him as our eyes and ears to see this character that he's bringing us to. I did take a different tact. Like, I was like, yes. Charlie Trammell is absolutely my protagonist and my main character. And as a result, all of his relationships need to be developed. And so his relationship with Anna, she also has to be a developed character. And I really enjoyed writing her. The original kind of leaping off point for me was there was a Black celebrity publicist who also doubled as a journalist that worked for Hattie McDaniel and several of the other stars. And I thought, okay, let's start there. Let's start with that profession and then just build her up. And yeah, I love Anna. I love Anna. I mean, I created her, so I should. But yeah, it was really fun kind of creating that relationship.
So we talked about this a little bit before we started, but there, especially, I think it was like 2 years ago when it became in like the public domain, there were a lot of retellings. And I have to say that this one was the one and I'm glad it didn't come back then. I'm glad it's now, because it didn't get kind of filed in the shuffle of all the others. But I really can dig my teeth into this one. This is just a really, I wouldn't even call it like it's a remix, but it's also its own thing.
Yeah, I always consider retellings is like covering a classic song. And sometimes when you cover a song, it's like you listen to it and you're like, why did they do this? So like they're just re-singing the song. Okay. It's just like it's the same song in a slightly different voice. We have the original, you don't need to do this. And then there's other times, and again, the perfect example of this for me is the Nine Inch Nails song Hurt. That was, I mean, that's a really interesting song by Nine Inch Nails. It's a very intense song. And then it was covered by Johnny Cash, and you hear him literally sing it into a completely different genre, and the message of the song becomes completely different. The Nine Inch Nails song is about angst and sort of this youthful aggression and fatalism, and the Johnny Cash song is about regret and longing, and it's a different thing. And it's this, yes, the structure, it's the same song, but it's completely different. And you understand why he chose that song, why he honored that song to bring it to a different place, because there's a purpose for it. So I think if you're going to do a retelling, you really need to have a purpose, not just trying to capitalize off a book that, to be honest, even F. Scott Fitzgerald couldn't capitalize during his lifetime. He didn't make any money off The Great Gatsby, right? So to try to just say, okay, well, this is a really popular book, so I'm going to do it when I'm going to throw in a slightly different character or a slightly different time period or whatever it is, why? But if you have a real purpose and you can bring the reader into that so that they can appreciate both the honoring of the original story and see why there's a good reason to bring it to a whole different world and a different structure and sing it into a new genre, then you got something.
And I think you did that so well. One of the things that I also adored about it was, again, you you learn a lot about Sugar Hill. It had, if you research it, it had some very interesting things, including, a very high, I guess, a trial or a court case about racial covenants. And that's kind of a big focus of this, as is the residents. And there's just a lot of nuance because it's almost like God, this is going to be the most cliche thing to say, that the neighborhood is a character, but when you're looking at the history of like Hattie McDaniels, for instance, she won an Academy Award for being in Gone with the Wind, but she also it was controversial. First of all, she couldn't go to the premiere party because of segregation and Jim Crow laws. She got a lot of flack for playing characters that were considered, that were stereotypes. And and there's this quote by her where she says something like, well, I could either get $700 playing a maid or $7 actually being one. It's,
Yeah, I can play.
and it's just like, you're kind of like in this, like between this, like these, you're being pulled between these two things. It's like, like, which way are you going? Is it this? Is it that? And there's just so much nuance to it, as there is to the neighborhood, because it is like this, almost like this little pocket of fantasy, much like Gatsby, versus how things are elsewhere. And
Yes.
it's still being criticized because the fact, like the question as to whether or not, there was a legality of it because of racial covenants was also coming into question. So, there was all of this with the story between Marguerite and James and her awful husband, because there's always got to be one of those in the story. And it really just painted a really interesting picture.
Yeah, one of the things I love about The Great Gatsby is it is both a celebration and a critique of capitalism. It's like it explores the allures of and the repulsion that you feel when you see conspicuous displays of wealth. And I really wanted to explore that in the Black community because it has a whole different connotation there. These are people who they were told they weren't supposed to build wealth, right? And yet they did. And that's an attribute, that's a strength. But it's also true that in a society that prioritizes individualism above most else, this idea of always wanting more and not necessarily lifting up the people around you, that gets complicated. And so you have to figure out, like, was Hattie McDaniel, she would say she's opening up doors for Black actors, right? And it's not like she had a lot of options in terms of being an actor. And I really have a lot of I have a lot of sympathy for her, and I also know that she saw her own upbringing, what poverty could be. Her father was actually a hero in the Union Army. I mean, he was an escaped slave and was it just fought heroically in the Battle of Nashville, and then couldn't get the government to pay him his pension or take care of his medical expenses, right? So she knew what that kind of sacrifice got you, which was not a lot, and so I really respect why she made the choices she did. But the reality is that she never turned down a role, even if she knew it was demeaning. And nor did she seek out roles like with the Black independent filmmakers. I mean, so she did choose a route that was going to protect her career. And I get it. And I also understand why the Black business elite of that time were really critical, because they felt that these Hollywood stars were demeaning the entire race and making life more difficult for them. And I think that they came from it from the perspective that, unfortunately, I think is still today we struggle with, where we have this feeling of like, well, if I did it, you should be able to do this, right? It's like, if I got here, I don't understand what your problem is. And that's just not realistic, but that is the bias. And so there was this clash within this community. But unlike in the white wealthy elite of 1925, where the Gatsby was set, in this community, if they don't find a way to come together, they will be destroyed immediately. Like, it's like because there's an outside force, and there are people actively trying to get them out of their homes. The only people that were supposed to live in those mansions were white people. And if you were Black, the only way you were allowed to live there is if you were a servant to a white person. That was the racial covenant. And so they were being brought to court. In that court case, I didn't know about it, and yet it's one of the most important court cases of our nation because it was the first time that a court case was tried, racial covenants was tried on purely constitutional grounds. And the lawyer who represented that neighborhood, Lauren Miller, actually went on to argue against racial covenants in the Supreme Court a few years later. I mean, he was handpicked by NAACP and Thurgood Marshall. It has to be Lauren Miller. He knows how to do this. And it should, I mean, and that's a history that should be known. It's like that was a pivotal moment. It really changed things going forward. Not enough, but it changed things. Yeah, and it drives me a little bit nuts that I didn't know it's like until a few years ago, and that we don't learn these things. And so I think I'm totally veering off from your question, but I but that is something that I think historical fiction really can help us with because we learn through storytelling. It's just, we learn through storytelling. You can read a nonfiction book, you can read an article, you're just not going to internalize it as much as you do a story, period. Every culture has mythology for a reason. Okay, it's like the storytelling is important. So, and we internalize things that way. So I wanted to bring these bits of Black history into a story that was entertaining and interesting and emotional enough that we can hold on to that. And again, I know I've completely veered off. So just feel free to rein me in and bring me
No,
back.
not at all. I think that, that is extremely important. I mean, a lot of times, and in general, I think, when we even look at Gatsby, it's all about that toxic love triangle where that's really almost like metaphor for everything else.
Right.
And I do want to talk before we close out just a little bit about the great man himself. I mean, Charlie has a lot of admiration for him. And he really is kind of just this larger than life character that exists behind a shroud of mystery. And I feel like you did that so well. How did you sort of build this titular character and make him very distinct from Jay Gatsby?
Yeah. Well, so for all of these characters, I used Gatsby for a jumping off point. I took a couple of traits and then just rolled with it. So, and that in some ways is not that different than building any character. Like if you start out a book and say, okay, I know this character has to be focused on revenge, and then you build from there, right? So in the case of James Reaper Mann, and I'm putting quotations around Reaper, the characteristic, other than the big parties, is, you know, Jay Gatsby has a sort of ridiculous optimism, despite all, it's like, why does he think he could just come in and woo this woman that he knew for what, like a week? Like, what are you doing, right? And I thought, okay, but to have that optimism in a dark-skinned Black man in the mid 40s, that's a whole different thing. Um, and and to have that wealth from a dark-skinned Black man in the mid 40s is a whole different thing. So so I started there and started thinking about how you would have to see the world when there's so many things coming at you, telling you that things aren't so great, that you are demeaned and diminished and hated by many, that, they're constantly putting these obstacles in front of you. How do you be optimistic, not just about yourself, but about the world? How do you do that in a way that's not necessarily tied to activism, but just tied to your own life, right? And so that's kind of where I started. And I realized that in a way that becomes a survival technique where it's like, it's going to be okay. We're all okay, and you just do the things you need to do, which may not always be completely legal, to live this optimistic vision of your life, right? But you kind of push that aside because you have to hold on to this vision of things being beautiful, and the romance of this world. And so you do what you need to do, but you keep your vision on the horizon, and that creates a very complicated character. I think about this because James is not honest. He is secretive. He does things that definitely put the people around him in danger. And yet he's also generous. He can be extraordinarily kind. He is definitely loyal. So is he a good man? Or, and to be honest, I mean, even with the awful, can you compare it to the awful husband, Terrence, right? Terrence is a philanderer, and he's extraordinarily egotistical, but he also did get to where he got in life, honestly. He helps Charlie get his start in life on a real career path. And he does, in his skewed way, he does stand up to the racists, right? So despite the fact that he demeans people frequently, he is not faithful, and he is very self-serving. I don't consider him a villain. So you just have these. Again, with Terrence, I'm like, okay, he's going to be a philanderer and egocentric. James has to be optimistic and throw big parties. And then you just build, and you remember the physical packaging of those traits and the time period, and then you can build these really fascinating, complicated characters that are your own, even though their genesis was with these Fitzgerald's characters.
It was wonderful. It was it was so good. It was good. It was a really, really good book, and I really hope to see much, much more from you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I am most definitely not done. So so yeah, I'm excited about what comes next, and I'm excited about this one too. So
Do you
thank
have anything planned, or you can't say?
you. I can't say much. What I can say is that I'm not moving too far away in the time period. So one of the things that happened was, when you start researching, you go through all these little rabbit holes. You're like, I didn't know that. Oh my God, look at that, look at that, look at that. So now it's like, I have to explore that, right? So it will be another historical fiction, bringing to light, again, other bits of history from the era that I don't think we look at closely enough right now. That's my new goal. I feel like right now, there are people who are actively trying to erase portions of our history. And there's a lot of things going on that I don't really know what to do about, but I do have the tools to do this and to elevate our history. And there's a rabbi actually here in LA, Steve Leader, who says, tend the parts of the garden you can reach. This is the part of the garden I can reach. So I will be doing that through my work. And I have the added benefit that I love it. So so that's what comes next.
Thank you so, so much, Kyra.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this talk. It was wonderful.
I agree. All right. We are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.